For those of you who have been here over the last little while, you know we've been going through the book of Ephesians as our sermon series. And if you've been here the last couple of weeks, you might have noticed we skipped some verses. And so we're going back today to those verses. So chapter 6 of Ephesians, we're going to be looking at verses 1 to 4. I think you'll know why we skipped them and left them for today. So if you want, follow along with me. Children, obey your parents. I think we could just leave now, couldn't we? Just walk right out. I think that's all that needs to be said. Oh, in the Lord, for this is right, even better. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. This is where it gets hard, guys. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Are you surprised that Paul would start off, when he talks about children, that he would start off by telling them to obey their parents? Anyone surprised at that? I mean, if you've grown up in the church, probably not. This just seems like it's normal. That's what should happen. But why would Paul tell children to obey their parents? Why would he start with that? I mean, that command for children to obey their parents is not a command that goes over well in our culture today all that much, right? Especially when he adds, for it is right. In our culture, obedience is given only if we feel the command to, or whatever we're being asked to do is right. If we don't like it, then we don't think we have to obey it. So where is Paul getting this? I think if you were to flip back to John chapter 14 and in verse 15, Jesus is talking to his disciples and he says this statement to them: if you love me, you will obey what I command. And in chapter 14 of John and even into 15, a number of times Jesus says the same thing to his disciples. If you love me, you will obey what I command. And so I think what Paul is doing here is he's picking up on what Jesus told his disciples, that an expression of love is often seen in obedience to what is commanded. And in this relationship of parent and child, who is in charge? The parent is, right? And so the parent is tasked with raising up a child, and the child is tasked with obeying those commandments. But what I think Paul is not saying is this. He's not saying that obedience to a parent means you obey in every circumstance. Because what I think he's also saying when he adds that small little phrase right after obey your parents in the Lord, what he's saying there is obedience to a parent cannot mean disobedience to God. And so as children, and let me just remind you, every single one of us is a child here this morning. We all have a parent, or had a parent, or parents, right? As children, we are to obey our parents unless their commands and their instructions go against what God has commanded for us to do in his word. But Paul doesn't stop there. Paul goes on to say that obedience isn't enough, because he jumps in with verse 2 and he pulls us back to the Old Testament where he quotes the fifth commandment: honor your father and mother. Honor your father and mother. And what I think he's reminding us is this: obedience is the thing that we see when you act. So obedience is seen through our actions, but honor needs to be reflected in our heart. So he tackles the whole obedience thing where he tells children to obey, to outwardly act as your parents want you to act, to obey their commandments, to obey what they ask you to do. But then he drives it in deeper and he says, look, obedience isn't enough. As a child, what God expects of you is not only outward obedience to your parents, but he's also expecting that you honor them. And honoring is more than just obeying. Honoring carries an element of respect with it. For those of you who have had young children, you know that you can often get obedience from your kids when they're young. You tell them what to do, and you can make them do what you want them to do, even if it means tying them down on their bed so they won't get out, right? You can make them do what you want them to do. But as they get older, if you have not worked on instilling in their heart a respect for you, when they hit those teenage years, you end up with what? A battle. Because all of a sudden, their outward action does not match up with what is going on in their heart. And that causes some tension for them because they're inside, they're going, I don't respect you, Dad. I don't respect you, Mom. Why should I obey you? And that's where often the battles come in for us as parents. So as parents, when our kids are young, that's when we need to start to create that culture and that attitude in them and portray for them what a good parent is so that they can honor us and create in their own hearts a respect for us. Because when we have our kids' respect, their obedience will follow. And too often we're so concerned on having them obey what we say to them or having them obey what we tell them that we forget that the underlying thing we really need to create in their life is that respect so that they will honor us, so that they will obey us later on in life because they want to. And we've earned their respect. And it was easy for them to honor us. Notice that when you read this commandment, the fifth commandment, there is no expiry date. So it does not matter how old you are. You are always a child to your parents. Your parent never looks at you and takes off those glasses and says, oh, you're no longer my child. It doesn't matter if you're 60 and your mom is 90. You are still her child. She will always view you as her child. Your dad will always view you as his child. And so the commandment in the Old Testament, and Paul reiterates it here, is that God expects us as children, no matter how old we are, that we honor our parents, no matter how old they are, because we are always someone's child. Honoring is more than respect, though. Honoring, I think, also includes gratitude. That we are truly grateful for our parents, our mothers and fathers. And so I know some of you maybe are here today honoring your father. You came because your dad asked you to come to church. So thank you. Thank you for honoring your dad in that way. Even if you never come to church the rest of the year, maybe except for Mother's Day. Hey, thanks. Thanks for showing that you respect your father and honoring him in that way. But honoring also implies more. There's this interesting discussion that Jesus has with the Pharisees one day. They're getting mad at Jesus because they observed that Jesus' disciples had not washed their hands before they had eaten. Sounds like the Pharisees were good parents, right? But they were getting mad. Why don't your disciples wash their hands before they eat? Because that breaks our tradition. And you know what Jesus says in response to them? He quotes the fifth commandment. He talks about honoring mother and father, and then he turns around and says, your tradition says that as a child, if you decide that you want to use the money that you would normally have used to take care of your parents in their old age, but if you want to take that and dedicate it to God and give it to the temple, that's okay. And what Jesus says is, you put your tradition ahead of the law and the commandment of God. And so by saying that, what Jesus is adding to this aspect of how we honor our parents is that as children, we are not allowed to neglect or forget our mother and father, no matter how old they are. And in Jesus' culture and many cultures of our world, when a parent gets old and they can no longer support themselves or live on their own, what happens is they move in with their children, right? In our culture, that happens sometimes, but more often than not, our view of taking care of good old mom and dad is to make sure they have a decent retirement home or an old age home where they can get fed at least 3 times a day and sleep in a room and not wander out into the world by themselves, right? I have 2 younger brothers, and this has come up. This discussion about who gets the privilege of taking care of mom and dad when that age comes up. And there's, some debating back and forth, usually has to do with inheritance and stuff, and being willing to give up some inheritance in order for someone else to look after. And to be honest, I know we're terrible sons, but usually the discussion revolves around who goes first and then who's left and what we would do differently. And my parents are here this morning, so I'm being quite open and honest in front of you all. And it's not like they haven't been privy to those discussions, although usually they're humorous and we keep them light. But the reality is, as kids, especially my age, maybe some of you are my age or a little bit older, that realization that our parents are getting older and that they're not going to be in the same state of health they are now. Or their circumstances will change, and that will impact on us. And so part of honoring your father and mother is understanding your responsibility as a child to them as they move into those stages of life where they need you more than they do now. So I think part for the church is to consider, how do we continue to honor our mother and father even as we grow into adulthood, into middle age, and even into older age ourselves. But I think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, why is it that why is it that God calls us to honor our parents? Partly when you raise your children, when they're young, you just tell them what they're to do. They don't ask why, oftentimes, until they get to a certain age. And then everything is why? Why do I have to go to bed at this time? Why do I have to eat that vegetable? Why? And so as a parent, you realize that you have to start to give your kids an understanding of why it is important that they obey, or why it is important that they do certain things. And so why is it important? Why would God ask us to honor our father and mother? And I think Paul tells us in verse 3, that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. He's quoting the Old Testament, the 10 Commandments, and he changes a couple of words to bring it into their context. But originally, when God gave this commandment to the Israelites, when they were moving into the promised land, part of the promise of honoring your parents is this, that they would live in the promised land a long time. When you read the Old Testament, you realize that God sets up what are often called blessings and curses. And he promised a bunch of blessings if the people of Israel would obey his commandments. But he also told them there would be some consequences, curses, if they didn't. And so one of those things, I believe, and what Paul is telling us this, is that when we honor our parents, and why it's important, is that for the Israelites, that they would live long in their land. And why would that be the case? What happens when we honor our mom and dad? It means that we obey them and we respect them. And what happens in a home when the children of the home obey their parents and respect their parents? It brings about stability and order. And so when you have a home where honoring is taking place and there is stability and order taking place, that creates a great foundation for the family. And if you have family after family after family after family having that in their homes, it then creates an amazing foundation for society, where the norm in society is order and stability. But it all starts back with a simple command of honoring your mother and father. You see, this promise is a community promise. It's a cultural promise that God is giving to the nation of Israel, and Paul is repeating it. And I think what he's saying here is that if we as children would be willing to honor our parents and live that way, then we will create homes and families where stability and order occur, and that will flood into our community and into our culture and into our society. And we will have a society that will be a great society to be in, and it will last. But not only that, he goes on to say one other thing, that it may go well with you. What is he saying here? Why would honoring your parents allow you to have a good life? I think part of what he's talking about here is not only a spiritual well-being, but it's an emotional well-being. A number of years ago, a study came out and was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. This study looked at about 36 international studies that covered almost 11,000 parents and children. And it covered studies that were done over about a 50-year period. And some of the things that they found in this study, and I'm going to highlight the father's piece of it because it's Father's Day, is this. That when a child experiences rejection from their father, they are more likely to have behavioral problems, more likely to have substance abuse or experience substance abuse, more likely to experience depression, and more likely to just be maladjusted. More so than if they experience rejection from their mother. But on the flip side, the positive side, when a child feels the father's love, a father's love in their life, they are more, there's so many good things that happen, but part of it is they actually have a better well-being, a better sense of well-being. They have a better outlook on life. Their substance abuse percentage goes down. Their depression, the instances of depression go down in children who have and experience a father's love. And this is what one of the authors of the study said. We've assumed for years that all kids need for normal, healthy development is a loving relationship with mom. And that dads are there primarily for financial support of the family. We now see how fundamentally wrong that is. That dads do play a very important role in a child's life. And for some children, they actually play a more important role than the mother does. I think when Paul is reminding us that we are called to honor our father and mother with the promise that it will go well with us, part of what he's saying there is we are rarely whole as individuals if we are not whole with our parents. If we have a relationship separation or a relationship issue with our parents, very rare is it for us to be whole emotionally as individuals. And so that's why he says and points out that this whole aspect, this whole relationship between a child and a parent is so important to us. That if you want stability and order in your life, if you want emotional well-being, if you want just a life that is good, this is an important relationship to focus on. In the Roman culture, the culture that Paul is writing this letter to, fathers had unlimited power basically over their kids. They were the authority figure in their life. And a father's ability and authority over their child extended basically the entire life of the child. So if your dad was 60 and you were an adult, he still had authority over you as your father. And for most cases, that didn't end until the father passed away. A father could decide to kill his baby if he wanted to. A father could sell his child into slavery if he wanted to. A father looked at obedience not as a suggestion, but as a command. That was the cultural expectation. Whatever dad said got done. Whatever dad wanted happened. And so you can see in this culture where a person, especially the fathers, have this unlimited authority, there's a lot of room for abuse, isn't there? And it did happen. And so think of that as in context, as Paul's writing verse 4. He now turns to fathers and says, "Fathers, do not exasperate your children." Think about that. Your dad sitting in church, listening to Paul say that, or hearing the letter being read to you, and you're going, "What are you talking about, Paul?" Children were created to obey me. Who cares if they get angry? They're children. Paul is coming at us with something that is so countercultural that fathers actually need to observe and understand how their actions affect their kids. This is not the norm for this culture of the day. What is Paul saying here? Fathers, do not exasperate your children. What is he saying here? I think what he's saying here is this. Fathers, be careful how you use your position as dad. Be careful how you use your position of authority in your child's life. And here's, I think, why. Dads, for some reason, we find it really easy to exasperate our children. This is not something we have to work at very hard. We can easily provoke, as one translation says, our children into anger. It just comes naturally to us, I think. Well, maybe it doesn't to you, but it does to me. And it's interesting that at different stages of development and life stages, we provoke our children differently. When my kids were young, one of the ways I provoked my children was tickling them. Right? I would just tickle them and tickle them and tickle them, and they would get so mad at me. In fact, just a couple weeks ago, one of my daughters told me that she learned how to say no because I tickled her so much. She would yell at me, "No, Dad, stop it." She would just get mad. In fact, Pam would often have to step in and say, "Hey, honey, listen to your child. They are not enjoying what you're doing right now. Stop tickling them." But we just find it so easy to provoke them. As they get a little older, one of the ways we often provoke and exacerbate our kids is that we don't respond to them. They come to us with an issue and we may not take it seriously, or we may just think, "I don't have time for this." And we just kind of brush them off. As they continue to get older, one of the other ways we often exasperate our kids is we don't actually allow them the freedoms that are appropriate for their age. And as parents, oftentimes we struggle with this with our firstborn especially. We make sure the boundaries are nice and tight, and then after the firstborn kind of gets through a stage, we realize that maybe we were a little too strict. And we allow number 2 and 3 or 4, in my case, a little bigger boundary level. I think one of the reasons why kids rebel sometimes is that we provoke them by not giving them the freedom they should have. And there's a lot of discussion there, and we could argue about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, but I wonder sometimes if that's not the case. Sometimes as fathers, we provoke our children because we don't give them the trust they should have. Sometimes we provoke our children when we favor one child over another. And as parents, if you have multiple children, you know that each child is different. They have different personalities, they have different strengths and different things. And so it's really a tough road to walk when you see one child operating one way and you want to give them certain parameters or certain trust or certain freedoms, and another child is not quite ready and you want to do the same thing. But it's an entirely different thing when you start favoring one over the other just because you get along with them easier or you just are naturally drawn to them easier. That is a clear and easy way to provoke a child. And this is one of the things that we're learning now in our stage of life, because we have our second oldest is now graduated. And so we're entering into that stage of parenting where we now have to release our children because they're becoming adults. And there's this tricky dance that you have to do where you have to start respecting their boundaries of how they want to live their life. And we haven't experienced this yet, but I've seen it. It really comes to a forefront when they get married, right? So you're actually adding another individual into your family. And now that couple is trying to sort out what's best for them. And you have mom and dad over here, and they're going, well, you're not operating like we operated as a family. And that creates a whole lot of tension, doesn't it? And I can see some of you smiling because you went through that with your own parents. But guess what? If you have kids, it's coming, if you haven't experienced it already. And here's the tension with it. As parents, we can provoke our kids if we continually want them to be within our boundaries of how to operate, and we don't respect their wishes of how they want to live their life. One of the ways, fathers, that we provoke our children also is that we love them for what they do, not who they are. Now, most parents, good parents, will say, well, I'd never do that, Brent. I love my kids. But here's the test. As soon as your kid starts to live his or her life in a way that is different than what your plan was for them, is there fireworks? It's really easy to provoke our children when they are not following the script that we've laid out for them for their life. And they want to make decisions on their own, even if they're bad decisions from a parental point of view. There's a parallel passage, and it's found in Colossians. Paul's writing to a different church, a different group of people, but he says basically the same thing. And in Colossians chapter 3, verse 21, he says this, "Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged." The word embittered there is the same Greek word that is translated exasperate or provoke in Ephesians. Same word, just translated differently in English. Why do I point that out? I point that out because I think when we provoke or exasperate or embitter our children, there are two ways they respond to us. One is either in anger or the other one is in discouragement. But they both result in usually the same thing, with your child withdrawing from you. And so if you are experiencing a relationship with your children where your children are withdrawing from you, and you're not sure why, maybe you need to check. Have you embittered them? Have you provoked them? Maybe what they're doing is a natural consequences of what you have been doing as a father to them. A couple weeks ago, Pam and I were in the car and we had the radio on and we kind of caught this program partway through. So I don't even know who this lady was, other than she was a psychologist. And she was talking on this show about the difference between how children view the love of their mother and the love of their father. And she said this, when a child looks at their mom, they just know that their mom loves them. And the reason they know that their mom loves them is that she gave them life. They were born out of her. she can't help but love them. She has to love them. It's like a divine decree. Mom has to love a child, her child. And for a child to question the love of their mother, the mother has to do something really bad, significantly bad, for a child to really question the love of her mother. But when it comes to the father, she said this, children look at their father and look at their father through an entirely different set of lenses. When a child looks at their dad, they don't assume that he loves them. They ask the question, does he love me? Over and over and over again. Over and over again, a child looks at their dad and says, Dad, do you love me? Whereas they look at mom, they just know she loves them. And so over and over again, what her point was that as fathers, we need to continually reassure our children that we love them. And whether that's through verbal affirmation, whether that's through hugging, whatever that is, dads, our kids don't look at us and just assume we love them. We have to almost, in essence, prove again and again continually that we love them. They don't just take it for fact. And in this case, I think in verse 4, when Paul talks to fathers about them exasperating their children, what he's speaking into is that oftentimes what happens in a parental relationship, there's a breakdown between fathers and sons and fathers and daughters. And if that's the case, what Paul is saying here is that the onus is on us dads to make sure that the relationship is whole. When he tells us not to exasperate our children, what he's also, I believe, saying is that when that relationship is broken or severed or damaged, as a father, because you're the father, no matter how old you are, no matter how old your child is, you are the father. So the expectation is that you will address that relationship breakdown. So when it comes to forgiveness and restoration of relationship, I think Paul is telling us, dads, that we are on the responsibility for making sure that those relationships are good. And it's no different than the picture we receive in the Bible. What does the Bible tell us? The Bible tells us that God our Father took the first step to reconcile us to him. God the Father sent his Son, Jesus Christ, to die on a cross, rise from the dead, so that we could have for forgiveness of sins, so that you and I could be reconciled with him. And so if God is showing us the model of what forgiveness and reconciliation looks like, I don't think it's a stretch that he expects us as fathers to be the ones to restore the relationships with our children if there is damage in that relationship. Paul starts off with this negative command. Don't do this. But then he jumps into a positive one. And at the end of verse 4, he says this, bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord. What does Paul mean when he says bring them up? It's a command, by the way. It's an imperative. It's in the present tense, which means that this is to be continually how we operate with our children. We are continually, I believe, trying as fathers to create a culture in our family where instruction and training can take place. The word training has undertones of discipline in it. So the Bible clearly talks about that as a role of a father is to make sure that children are disciplined appropriately. In fact, Hebrews tells us that if fathers and parents, we don't do this, then God will discipline our children for us. But then instruction has these undertones of education, and particularly when it adds in the Lord, this education in the things of God, in terms of spiritual development, in terms of character development, in terms of self-control, obedience, knowing God's will. As a father, God is asking us, dads, to make sure that in our home, we create a culture where we are teaching our kids about the things of God and how to follow God appropriately and how to follow him well. And what I think Paul is trying to tell us, and this is the one thing, dads, If you leave here today with nothing but this is what I want you to leave with. Fathers, your most important instruction is your example. If you want to create a culture in your home where this verse becomes true, then your example will be the most important thing your kids will learn from. Let me just share four things quickly about what I'm talking about when I'm talking about example. First thing, love your wife. It is not an accident that Paul, previous to these verses at the end of chapter 5, spends a number of verses talking about the husband-wife relationship. And he ends that just before chapter 6 starts by saying that husbands, you are to love your wives. And when the Bible talks about love, it is always in the frame of self-sacrifice. Husbands, love your wives sacrificially. And when you do that, you will be an example to your children about what a proper relationship is supposed to be. Second, not only love your wives, but second, do not be a hypocrite. Dads, if you are one way publicly, out in the church, out in the world, out with the sports teams, and you are another person at home, your kids see that. If you want to ruin your kids' ability to honor you easily, operate that way. Third, if you want your kids to have a great example, follow God. The commandment is to bring up our children in the instruction and discipline and training of the Lord. The only way we can do that is if we ourselves are doing it. Just remember, this whole context of chapter 6 comes out of chapter 5. In chapter 5, verse 21, it talks about submission. And one aspect of submission is children obeying their parents. But we, as fathers, have to submit to someone as well, and that's God, the Father. So there is this example of us submitting to God so that they can see what submission truly looks like. And I think fourthly, if we want to be a good example to our children, this verse implies that we are in their lives. You cannot train, you cannot instruct your children if you are not spending time with them. We have to be in their lives. Now, some of you are here this morning, and some of you, unlike me, I have a good dad. I have good parents. I grew up in a good home. For me, it is very easy to honor my parents. I don't struggle with it at all. Not at all. I want to honor them. But for some of you this morning, you grew up in homes where either you had a terrible dad or you have no dad at all. And some of you are here, are single moms, and you have no father figure for your child. And so you're listening to me and going, oh, that's great, Brent, but you don't know what my life is like right now. You're living in an ideal world. And Paul seems to be talking to an ideal world. But here's my reality. For those of you who find yourselves with bad fathers, terrible fathers, or no fathers at all, I will point you back to God. Because God is all of our Father. And He's a good Father. Josh McDowell, who's some of you may know as a pastor and apologist, when he grew up, his dad was an alcoholic. And so before he became a Christian, when Christians would tell him that God was a good father, he would just look at them, and because in his mind, the word father, he equated with pain. That was his reality. And he talks about his journey to Jesus and how through that journey, he had to come to the place where he had to accept that God was a good father. And he couldn't come to faith until he accepted that. But once he did, he could come to faith and become a Christian. Some of you, your lives are not whole because of that, what John Eldredge would call a father wound in your hearts. And you haven't gotten to the place where you have turned that over to God the Father and been able to reconcile that with God And I encourage you to do so. One of the heroes in the church, in this church, is there's a father in our church who has daughters, but he volunteers as one of our boys' discipleship group leaders. So he goes and spends time with other kids, other sons, other boys in our church that are not his own, hanging out with them, being a godly example to them, being a father figure to them. And I think this is where, as a church, we have the opportunity to come alongside those who have never had a good father or don't have a father, and we can fill in that void for them, not becoming their dad, but becoming men who can step into that realm and be that man that child needs to look for to see what a good male role model is. And for some of you this morning, that's maybe what God is asking you to do. He's putting a little boy or a little girl on your heart to think about, hey, you need to invest in that kid's life because they need you. Fathers, you may be looking at your life right now and you realize that there have been some pretty big mistakes in your life. Maybe your relationship with your children is severed or extremely tense. This is what I want to tell you. It is never too late to be the father that God wants you to be. Never. I had the privilege this week of doing a graveside. And the family was burying the ashes of their father. And it was interesting to stand there and listen to some of the family share. And one of the daughters shared about how her dad had struggled with some things in life, including some bitterness. But near the end of his life, he turned a corner and he went and felt called by God to go to people where he had relationships that were torn and asked for forgiveness. And so he sought out after person and did that. And she said after he did that, you could just see the burden lift off him. And he was a different man. He was the man God created him to be. And it was so cool at the end of that, this dad's son stepped forward and said, you know what? Dad finished well. Dad, fathers, it's never too late to finish well. Never. Even if you have years of doing things poorly, it is never too late to finish well, because that, in essence, is the story of the gospel. It is never too late. Never too late to turn your life over to Jesus. Never too late to live as God wants you to live. Fathers, what Paul is telling us to do is what he's told us all along in Ephesians. He's calling us to live a life worthy of the calling he has given us. So let's be the men that God is calling us to do, to be the fathers that he is calling us to be. I know it's a hard job. I know there are days when it seems impossible and difficult. But God has given us this role, and he will give us the strength to carry it out. Let me pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for today. God, we live in a society that does not honor fathers. In fact, fights against many of the things that you ask fathers to do, including the responsibility and even authority that you've given fathers in the home. And so, Lord, I pray for our church. I pray that we will be a church where children honor their parents, and that there will be homes that are full of stability and order. Lord, for those who don't have a father or have a really bad father, I pray that you will come alongside them and be that father for them. Lord, I pray for single moms who are just wrestling, trying to survive. Lord, help them to find some men that can pour into their kids' lives and be that father figure for them. But most of all, Lord, help us to honor you, because you are the good, good Father for all of us. In Jesus' name, amen.